Hi, my name is Alan Revere. In this series of videos, I'm going to guide you through a number of projects that will demonstrate the fundamentals of making jewelry. If you follow along by making your own version of each project, you will learn to properly use the essential tools and execute the basic techniques of goldsmithing. Here at the Revere Academy of Jewelry Arts, projects like these have become proven exercises in teaching the classical art of goldsmithing, much like the traditional European training I received early in my career. These projects are similar but different to the ones in my book Professional Goldsmithing, and are designed to help you succeed in making wearable and attractive jewelry. The important thing to remember as a beginner is that you will make mistakes. You may even need to start a project over again, but mistakes are part of the learning process. With a reasonable amount of effort and patience, these tapes will help you build the skills needed to create professional quality work. These are the projects we're going to cover in these tapes, and they teach you a range of skills, starting with very easy ones all the way up to quite advanced techniques. This project shows how to use sterling silver sheet to create a pair of pierced earrings. We're going to focus on the use of a saw for piercing, filing, and engraving the lines. I hope you enjoy these tapes. I hope you get something out of them, and I hope you enjoy making jewelry. In this first project, we're going to make a pair of earrings. They're very simple. They require basically the use of two tools, a saw and a file. The idea is that we're going to make a sandwich with the design, which comes from a book of Japanese family crests, and two sheets of metal. And in between the sheets of metal, we're going to put a piece of white paper so that they'll stick together. We're going to use Elmer's type glue to do this and just make a sandwich. Then we're going to drill holes in each of the black areas and then use a jeweler's saw to pierce out those areas and finish up with filing the lines so that the edges are true and smooth. So the first step is to glue the four pieces together. This is 0.65 silver sheet, that's 24 gauge. And I've polished the surface just a little bit in the beginning so that there'll be less polishing later. So if you take some Elmer's type glue, spread a thin coat over the metal, spread it out with your finger so there's a nice thin layer all over. Put a piece of paper on top. Okay, and then take the other piece of metal, put some glue on the surface, another thin layer. There's a lot of different types of glues that can work, and most people don't think that this kind of glue works well on metal, and in fact it really doesn't, but by having the paper in between, they do adhere really well. Okay. And then the third part to glue is the pattern itself. Now this glue is going to take a few minutes to dry, and it also needs to be kept pressed together, so we're going to put it under a weighted anvil so that it sticks together. You want to line it up just as well as you possibly can. Okay. Okay, now that the glue is dried and we have a sandwich of 2 layers of paper and 2 layers of silver, we're ready to use a center punch to locate the holes where we're going to drill. It's very important to do this because you can't drill without a starting point. The drill will just scoot around. So put the center punch where you want the hole, and with a chasing hammer, tap the end of the center punch. The metal we're using was purchased from a supplier, and you can do that too. You can buy metal of all different gauges. You can buy wire of different gauges and different shapes. You want to do this carefully. Making jewelry is a lot like building a house. You have to make sure that you have a good foundation. If you're building a building, the most important thing is the four corners, because everything is based on that. Well, when you make a piece of jewelry, the most important step is the step you're doing, and then every step after that is more important. If you make a mistake in the beginning, things will never get better. This is a flexible shaft machine. I have a drill bit in here. It's a twist drill. There's all different kinds of flexible shafts. The most common type hangs from above you with a motor and then a big shaft, and has a universal handpiece with a little chuck key that changes the opens the collet. This is a kind of a high-tech one, and it's very accurate. What you want to do is make sure that you have the metal supported from behind, and drill very slowly, actually. The rule here is slow speed, high feed. Also, you can lubricate the drill in between each use, make it last a little longer, and it'll cut a little bit easier. This lubricant is a type of wax that doesn't evaporate. You can use beeswax or paraffin. There's all different kinds of waxes. This is a high-tech wax that comes from the aerospace industry, and it's available to mount on your bench just like this. Now, if you were working in gold, you'd want to save all these little filings, and that's what the bench pan is here for. Now, the key here is to save yourself some work, and that's why we've laminated these sheets together. You could make 2 copies of this pattern, lay them out separately, drill them, saw them, and file them separately. But you can also save yourself a lot of effort by doing them both at the same time. But what that means is that you have to be even more accurate, and all of your tools have to be exactly vertical, so that your drill bit can't go through at an angle, and neither can your saw. Otherwise, the shapes of the metal won't be the same. Now, you could hold the metal flat and drill perpendicular this way, but it's not as comfortable. What I like to do is put the tool in the position that's most comfortable, and then bring work to the correct position in relationship to the tool. Okay. This is a jeweler's saw frame. There's all different types. They're not very expensive, and the key idea here is that you have 2 clamps at the top and the bottom that hold a very fine saw blade. There are different sizes of saw blade. The one that I find most useful is a 3/0, and it has teeth that point one way or the other. In this case, I want the teeth to point downward, and the way I make sure that that's happening is by running my finger down the saw, but it won't run up because it catches on the teeth. And you want to spring the frame up against your breastbone and clamp it tight, and you should be able to hear a little note, which means it's tight. If it's too loose, it'll break. Okay, that's the way you string the saw blade, but in this project we want to cut out each of these areas, so we're going to want to thread the blade through each hole. Again, you can use just a little bit of lubricant, and also you probably want to be sitting a little bit lower. So I have a chair that goes up and down. I'm going to lower down so that my arms are just about parallel to the floor, so that I'm not hunched over, and I don't get a lot of fatigue from doing this kind of work. Okay, let me explain a little bit about sawing. First of all, when you choose a saw blade, it should be about 2 or 3 teeth for the thickness of the metal. If the saw blade is larger than that and there's only one tooth, it's likely to catch, and that won't work very well. The best way to use a saw is straight up and down. I'm cutting a curve here, so I very slowly and evenly turn the work, blow away the dust. You want to be very careful not to hit the lines, because if you hit the line, you're over the boundary. It's better to take it in phases. You can always go back and move that border out, but once you've gone too far, you can't go back. Okay, now you can move to the next section. Okay. When you're cutting a corner, a sharp corner, what you have to do is keep the saw blade moving straight up and down as you turn the work or the saw very slowly. You don't use much force on a saw frame like this. Basically, the weight of the saw brings it down. Again, kind of sawing in place when making a sharp turn. Come around the curve. Saw blades break very easily, so don't get upset if you, at first, break a lot of saw blades. Now you might notice that I'm using the saw as a file. I'm a little farther away from that line than I want to be. So by kind of rubbing the saw up and down and leaning it, not tilting it, but leaning it, you can clean up that area. All right. Let's do one of the straight-sided areas next. These are pretty small, so they're not going to take a lot of effort. Now, I'm supporting the work on what's called a bench pin. This is something that you purchase as kind of a stock item and then customize it through your own use so that it fits the style of work that you like to do. So very carefully here, try to stay right on the line. Very little force. Okay, right at the end, so let's make a sharp turn. Going up and down, trying to use the whole length of the saw blade as you work. It's very important to clamp the work firmly against the bench pin. And the bench pin has a horizontal surface with a V in it so that you can saw, and it's supported all around. If you don't think you did a good job, go back, use the saw as a file, just hit the edges just a little bit more. Okay, so that's it for the little ones. Okay, time to cut out the two big areas. These are actually much easier. Just go out to the edge and carefully follow that line. You can either turn the work slowly or turn the saw blade slowly. Okay, when I get to the end here, I'm going to leave just a little bit of a contact point so that visually it looks like the interior design is suspended in this circle. So right there is where I'm going to cut it off, And I'll come back later and clean that up a little bit and make it look even more like it's freely suspended. Very important to cut these well the first time. These are hard surfaces, difficult surfaces to file. So if you can do it right the first time, you'll save yourself a lot of time. As a matter of fact, somebody asked me recently, what's the quickest shortcut that I know? And the quickest shortcut I know is to do it right the first time, because then you don't have to do it over and over again. You have to be able to see very well to do this kind of work. And if you're struggling to do it, you should have some magnification. You can use optical aids that go, that rest on your head and you look through. If your saw blade breaks, it's because of one of two things. Either it's not tight, or you're twisting it, because these saw blades are brittle. Okay, saw blades come in a wide variety of sizes, with 8/0 about the thinnest, 5/0 is a little bit thicker, and 3/0 is what I'm using now. If you're working on larger, thicker work, you could use a 2/0 or go the other way and use a number 1 or a number 2. Those aren't used very much for jewelry work. There's also different brands of saw blades, and everybody has their own favorite. They're convinced that the one they use is the perfect saw blade. I honestly think that it's much more important to have a skilled craftsman than a good saw blade. You know, if you ever get tired, and this is tiring, just take a break, walk away. Don't want to make a mistake. Go. So that's pierced out. I can see that the line is pretty good. There's a couple of areas where I'm going to want to file and clean it up. Okay, once again I want to tell you about cutting around curves and cutting around sharp corners. When you go around a curve, you're very slowly rotating either the work or the saw, very gradually. But when you get into a corner, you have to do something different. You get right up to the corner, all the way in there, right to the end. Then you pull back on the saw as you kind of go up and down in place. If you turn the saw too abruptly, the blade will break. So here it is again. Right into the corner, all the way. Pull back, and there's a sharp turn. Now we can go back in a couple of minutes and recut that or file it to make it even sharper. And there we are. Now, ideally, both sides will be the same. And the pattern on this side will be exactly the same as the back. In fact, By looking at the back, you can see how well you followed the lines and how vertical you held the saw. So there's a little bit of variation there. It's going to take a little cleanup, but that won't be too hard. Okay. So the next step is to look and see, are there any places where we want to go back with the saw? Yeah, there's a couple in there. So now I'm going to flip the metal over and go from the other side just to true up some of these corners, using the side of the saw as a file, going right into the corner. You should be able to get these perfectly square this way. Okay, the cleanup process can take a long time. And what you're trying to do is make these lines straight. Don't just look at the negative space. Look at the way one cutout is going to line up with the other one. They should all be identical also, these 4 diamond shapes in the middle. So make sure to line up the saw with the shape that's next to it. When you're making a piece of jewelry, you generally work from the inside out. And you always start with the very interior of a design and make it perfect, and then worry about the parts that are outside, because everything is based on the inside, and it's easier to change the outside of a shape to conform with the inside than vice versa. Yeah, that looks better. A long time ago, I decided that I wasn't a perfectionist. And even though people think I'm a perfectionist, I'm convinced I'm not, because if I were a perfectionist, I'd still be working on the first piece of jewelry that I ever made. So everything's a compromise. But you want to do your best. In order to clean up the pattern, I'm going to use a set of needle files. These are very small files. They come in different shapes. They also come in different sizes. This is a barrette needle file. It's flat on one side and has no cuts on the other. It's good for going on the outside of curves or long flat areas. And you see, you kind of roll it as you're going. So you get a nice, even cut. But you don't want to tilt it, because that would change the plane of the edge. So you clean up with the barrette needle file as much as possible. Okay, and then you can use a square needle file. A square needle file is good for small, flat areas, like these. It's good for making sharp corners. This corner right in here, and you can also roll it around for the flat surfaces. Here's another flat surface here, little corner. Now these files are sharp, so you have to be careful only to apply force where you want the metal to be removed. They come in different cuts. These are number 4 cut. That's pretty fine. And you can get them in all the way from 0 to, I guess, 6, which is the finest. Oh. Make sure you know what you're doing. Make the corner crisp. And just systematically work around the piece, doing the same process to every different section. You don't want to finish one section and then go on and finish another. You want to bring all the surfaces down at the same time. You can tell when one of these little cutouts is smaller because the file won't go in as far. This one's a little smaller than the one on the other side, so I'm going to work on it a little bit. Kind of working around. Now the file goes in a little deeper. You could actually measure to make sure that they're the same size. That's how far the file goes in on this side. And on this side, it goes in just about the same. Okay, so that's a round needle file, a square needle file, and the barrette needle file. There's another needle file that we're going to use here. This is called a crossing file. It has two curves, a gentle curve on one side and almost a half round on the other. And that's good if you want to try and match a curve. The little curve would be too tight for this, for cleaning up this surface. So I'm using the more gentle curve. Files cut on the forward stroke. Don't necessarily want to drag the file back. It doesn't really do much. Also, if you want to get a smooth cut, push the file at an angle, kind of diagonal, and let it roll. See how it looks. There's a little bit of a flat spot here, so we'll try and file that out. Okay, that's a little bit better. Alright, now it's time to saw out the outside. And the reason we're doing this last is because the outside holds the inside together and it's giving it some stability. And as soon as we cut this apart, both of the pieces of silver could easily come apart because there won't be much area where they're connected. So, I want to do this very accurately. Okay, there we are. Next step is to file the outside. What I'm doing here is resting the file up against the bench pin and observing the line. Actually, there's no line, but following the curve visually. So I work around. And the file has a safe edge right over here where there's no cuts. And that's what's riding on the bench pin. Turning the piece into the work. Now it's important to keep the file rolling, because if you just filed flat like this and then like this, you get facets. You don't want to do that. You want to have one continuous curved surface. Also want to make sure that you hold the file in the correct plane, because we don't want one side to be smaller than the other. Just work your way around. And as you can see, this is all based on the inside shape. So if the inside shape is accurate, then you stand a better chance for the outside to be accurate. Looks good. And I think at this point, let's see if the paper will come up. Peels right off. And you can also see how the paper protected the surface. On the other side, it's all scratched up from riding along the bench pin. And there it is. Alright, not bad. Alright, it's a little thin over here. You're always looking to see where could it be better? What could I do to improve it? You know, it's a little thicker right here, it's a little thin here and here, so I'm going to file in that area just a little bit. Safe edge down, and roll it. Pretty good. Looks pretty good. All right. And now that the paper's gone and I can see the the metal itself, it's a good chance to do just a little bit of finishing of the pattern on this side. We'll go back into all these areas and crisp them up just a little bit. The 4 inside diamond shapes. Make sure that they're the same on this side. Yeah. If you see anything that needs a little help, just focus on it. And the metal is kind of thin now, so you don't want to risk bending it. You want to be kind of gentle. Okay. And then these 2 little creases on both sides. And use the barrette file. And what I'm really trying to do is see if I can line up the edge of the pattern. That's the hardest part. You know, here it looks pretty good, and this is a little bit off. This could be filed back here. You're constantly looking to evaluate what you do and to improve it. There's really 3 steps to that process, and it goes for anything in jewelry or anything else you do. The 3 steps to improving your work. The first step is to evaluate it, to analyze it, to observe it. You just say, oh well, this is the way it is. It's a little crooked here, and it's a little bit long here, and this side's a little bit wide. And the second stage of that is to figure out, well, what are your options? Well, you could file it over here, or you could, do something to the other part, and you're figuring out, well, what kind of tool would work, and what steps would you take, and what are the alternatives? And then the third step is to do it. But you really need to break it down so that you don't just jump in there blindly or wildly and make it worse than it was. Okay. Now, it would be really nice if these surfaces were very smooth, the ones that I'm filing, so that they didn't need much polish. And they're going to be so thin that it would be tough to polish them anyway. The large one on the outside is going to be easy, but all the rest are going to be pretty tough to get in there and sand or polish, which is ordinarily the next step would be to sand the surface that you file. But since this metal will be so thin, it's going to be tough to do. One way to take them apart is with a bench knife or a little pen knife, like this. And if you slip it right in there, find maybe a little part where it's a little bit open, and you'll see very carefully, without bending the metal, it cuts apart pretty easily. If it doesn't, what you can do is put it in a refrigerator, and actually in a freezer, and often when it comes out, it'll break apart easier. Or you could put it into solvent or hot water, and you can see again how the protected surfaces are very highly polished. So when you do this kind of work, what you want to do is put the best 2 surfaces together face to face so that they're protected. And then when you take it apart, those will become the front of the earrings. Okay, the next step is to take the rest of the paper off. So I'm going to go and put them in hot water, and that should melt off the glue and dissolve the paper. Okay, now that the paper is off, we can take a good look at it, see what else it needs. And one thing to keep in mind is that if you talk to 10 jewelers and ask them how to do something, you're going to get no less than 10 methods for solving a problem. One thing to keep in mind is that ultimately this piece of jewelry should be polished. And so in order to make that go as smoothly as possible, it would be good to have a very fine finish on the metal before you take it to the polisher. There's several ways to do that. One way is to go to finer files, like these number 6 files, and go over the same shapes and redo those surfaces just a little bit more, truing them up. This time it is effective to just look at the edge of the work. This is putting a finer cut on the surface of the edges so that they will be easier to polish. You could use abrasive paper like sandpaper, carborundum paper, something like that. You could also use abrasive tapes, which are now on the market, like these here. These are kind of like crocus cloth. They come in different grits and different shapes. This is a round one. This would be good for getting into small round areas, and what you could do is tie part of it onto something, onto a nail, hold it back, string the piece on, and rub it up and down. Or you could even string this in your saw frame and go up and down to clean up areas. Alright, so at this point we want to make this as perfect as possible, just truing up the lines, squaring them off, trying to get everything to meet as best as possible. Using the square file for the little square areas, the triangle file for the little triangular areas. And the round file, also number 6. These are all 6-cut files for the round areas, putting on a finer finish and correcting them just a little bit more. And then for the outside of the curves, you can use a barrette file. You can also hold it like this. And there's some advantages and disadvantages to all these different methods, and when you try them you'll figure out what feels comfortable for you, what works best, and that's probably what you should do. Ultimately, there's no right or wrong way to do any of this. Your goal is to make it as good as possible, and whatever tool and whatever method you use that works for you is the solution. It's time to work on the surface. It started out pretty polished, but it's gotten scratched along the way. So we want to use an abrasive paper to put a better finish on here. And the theory here is to put on several layers of abrasive paper, or in fact use several layers of abrasive paper, going finer and finer along the way, and crossing the grain that the paper is in. So the first one, since this is pretty fine, the first one I'm going to go to is 600 paper, and they come in all kinds of grits, 220, 400, 600, and then we'll use 4O paper. But what I want to do is show you how to wrap a paint stick in abrasive paper to make a really useful tool. So what you want to do is get one of these nice crisp paint sticks from the hardware store, and you can use a file or a scribe or anything like that with a sharp edge, and line it up on one side and scribe a line to make a crease. Very carefully roll the paint stick, make another, very carefully without letting it slip, roll it one more time, and then the fourth time, and now we have all 4 corners established. And you can go back and wrap this around, and what you wind up with is a very crisp, flat-sided, square-cornered stick that's going to be useful for finishing. And from here on out, it's pretty easy to roll it, scribe it, just keep on going. And you can see that the corners are square. That'll be useful. Now what I'm doing is creating a stick that's renewable, so that when one layer gets worn out, I can just tear it off and have another layer that's ready to be used. So there's just about 4 layers on here. All right, the next thing to do is to take it over to the vise over here, and we'll staple it with, we'll staple it in 3 places. Now the vise is mounted on a stump, and this is a pretty important tool to have around. On the stump is also an anvil and a couple of different kinds of steel blocks. And then there's hammers strapped to the outside. So with a regular stapler opened up, position it, and there you go, 1. And that should just tear off. And we have now a renewable tool with very fine paper. This is 600. And what I do is cut off the excess on both ends. And then mark it with some sort of system so that from the end you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I can see that this is 600 paper, because you can't always tell 6 dots. All right, and now we want to sand surfaces. Now this is putting lines on the metal. It's also taking down any burrs or irregularities. It's making the edges clearer, and it's a necessary step prior to buffing and polishing. And you can finish up by having all the lines go in one direction. This is carborundum paper. You could use it wet or dry, although we'll be using it dry. Okay, that looks pretty good. Flip it over and do the other side too. When it's been properly sanded, then the only lines you can see are the ones you're putting in with the abrasive paper. You're taking out any other lines, all other lines, so that everywhere on the surface there is a very faint pattern of sanding lines. If you didn't do this and you went right to buffing and polishing, and you expected the buffer to take out deep scratches, by the time you got to the bottom of those scratches with the buffer, then you will have removed lots of metal and probably distorted the surface. Since this is pretty thin, I don't want to over polish. The idea is to polish it just as little as possible. Okay, well that looks pretty good, and now that I've sanded the surfaces with 600, I'm going to make a stick that's just a little bit finer. It's a 4-0 stick, and finish off the flat surfaces. Okay, now this is very fine paper. You want to go in a direction that's across the previous marks so that you can tell when you've got the surface down to the next level. This puts on almost a polished finish. It's going to make the buffing and the polishing much easier. Before we dome the metal, we have to make sure that it's soft and workable. Now what happens is as you work metal, it becomes harder. The grains become stretched through working, and the metal becomes less malleable. Now what would happen if you went to dome this now is that it would bend at the very thinnest points and you'd actually get creases. The way to make the metal soft is to anneal it, and what that means is to heat it up and quench it, which forces the grains to reorganize into a small random pattern, and the metal is more malleable that way. Now there's another thing to deal with, and that is fire scale and tarnish. When you heat metal with a torch, it oxidizes, and that's okay on most metals, but on silver it's not okay, because what will happen is that the copper that's below the surface will become oxidized, and you'll get a purplish grayish kind of shadow that's just below the surface that you see sometimes. That's called fire scale. One way to prevent that is to coat the metal with flux or something like a glaze, which seals the metal off from the air and prevents the oxygen from reaching the surface. This is a solution of boric acid and alcohol. Boric acid is like borax. It's something like a flux. And so when we heat it up, it's going to glaze over and seal the metal from the atmosphere and prevent the oxygen from getting to the surface. The alcohol carries the boric acid, and as soon as you ignite it, you can see that the alcohol burns off. And that leaves a very thin coat of this white boric acid powder. There are different formulas and different compounds that you can purchase. This is the simplest, to just buy powdered boric acid, not granular, but powdered boric acid. There are three types of flames. This is fuel only. This is called a reducing flame. Whatever oxygen is in the air is consumed, and all that's left is the fuel. As you add oxygen, which is what I'm doing slowly, and the yellow disappears, this is a neutral flame. It's balanced, and all the oxygen that's being added is being used up with the fuel. As you add oxygen, and the flame becomes hot, and it becomes a hissing flame, then you have extra oxygen. This is called an oxidizing flame. And if you heat the metal with this kind of flame, the extra oxygen can combine with the copper that's below the surface and form copper oxides, which will give you fire scale. And that's something you don't want to happen. So you can use a neutral flame, a slightly reducing flame, with just the tip having a little bit of yellow, and heat the metal very softly, very slowly. You can see that the boric acid liquefies and coats the surface. So you want to heat the metal until it's got the very, very faintest hint of a red color. And that's sometimes difficult to see, and it might help if you turn out the lights so that you can see the color of the metal more clearly. You want to heat it very, very evenly. In actuality, all of the metal doesn't have to be the same temperature at the same time, but it all has to reach the same temperature at one time or another. And that's just about it. You gotta be careful, you don't want to overheat the metal. Now all precious metals are quenched immediately except for nickel white golds, which are treated a little bit differently. So now that they've been quenched, they're cooled, there's oxides trapped in the boric acid glaze on the outside, and we're going to take them over to the pickle. Be sure that your area is well ventilated and that you use only copper or bamboo tongs when putting things in and taking them out of the pickle. You can't use iron, it will ruin the solution. In order to dome the metal, we're going to use a dapping block. Dapping blocks are available either in steel or in wood. In this case, we're going to use the wood one. These are called dapping punches or ball punches. And what you want to do is take the silver, put it into a fairly shallow form, and use the largest punch possible, and very gently tap the metal down in stages, working from the outside inward. By working, in this case, with a steel tool into a wooden form, we're not very likely to squeeze the metal and deform it. Instead, we're just shaping it. And the wood is not scratching the surface. The steel on the back may be scratching the surface, but that is the back of the piece. And if you do it very gently, it probably won't scratch it at all. Since the steel is coming into contact directly with the silver, it's important to keep your tools polished and free of any scratches or nicks that would become imparted onto the silver. Very light blows, very gently, forming the metal, pushing it and shaping it without changing its cross-section. And compare the two pieces. See if they're domed evenly. Looks pretty good. Okay, they're not quite flat. They're pretty flat, actually. And that's all there is to it. In order to bring out the basket effect of this design, we're going to use a saw to scribe lines between the overlapping patterns. And so that we don't make a mistake, it's good to lay these out beforehand. This project really teaches you how to use a saw. So far we've used the saw to pierce the pattern, we've used the saw as a file to clean up the edge, and now we're going to use the saw as a graver to scribe lines. Put a new saw blade in. Remember, with the teeth pointing downward. It's probably a good idea to insert it in the pattern before you start. Okay, now what we're going to do is very gently follow the design, tilt the saw so we're cutting only through the top and not through the bottom. Make sure to line the cuts up. Cut on all the black lines. Only a little bit. You don't want to go all the way through the metal. So the idea here is to notch it or put a little bit of a cut on the top surface that's accessible, just enough to give a suggestion that the metal is cut all the way through. And once you insert the saw into one of the openings, you do all the cuts that you can from that one. Now some of these may need to be touched up. After we're done, we'll take another look at it. And very carefully and systematically line up the saw so that the cut follows the weave pattern. And you're going from both sides of each cut as far as you can. So from the top, it will look like the metal is pierced, and from the back, the metal will be solid. In order to see your cuts better, you can go back now with a very fine 4-0 paper and take off the ink and bring the surfaces back to a polish or near polish. And this should make your pattern stand out and also point out any areas that you need to work a little bit more on. Okay. So parts of it look pretty good and parts of it need a little bit more work. Okay. All right. As you can see, the piercing, which comes from both sides, gives the impression that the metal is woven. In fact, the cuts are made at an angle so that there's a little peak at the middle where they meet. And on the back, it's not pierced at all. So for strength, the metal is left intact. The next step is to make a pair of ear wires and drill 2 holes for them in the top of the earring. I'm going to locate the holes by using a flexible ruler and finding symmetrical points on the design. In this case, it'll be these corners where everything lines up. And then making a little tiny mark halfway up the metal. Do that on the other one as well. So let's drill a couple of holes. And this drill bit is just over 1 millimeter. It's actually 18 gauge exactly. 1.02. And you want to go very, very slowly and carefully, supporting the metal from behind. The metal is very thin, so you really have to be extra careful. And there it goes, right through. Slow speed, high feed. Not too fast. And by pushing, it'll cut really well. Take off the burr, which is always left on the edge. The sharper the drill bit, the less burr that's left after making a hole. And the next step is to bend a couple of ear wires, or French hooks as they're called. And for this, it's a good idea to use metal that's 0.8 of a millimeter. As you can see, this is 0.78, 0.79. That's 20 gauge. Now the silver that you buy is usually half hard, which means it's been drawn through a draw plate a few times, so it's a little springy, but it's soft enough that you can bend it really easily with your fingers. For an ear wire, you want it to be very springy, so you want to harden it. And as I mentioned earlier, metal becomes hard when you work it. So there's a few ways to do that. You could draw it through a draw plate a few more times. That would make it hard, but it would also make it smaller. So what we're going to do is clamp both ends into pliers and twist it. The twisting will harden the metal and will be hardly noticeable. This is a hand vise. So if you put the metal in there just a little bit and clamp it down, so that'll be one end. Straighten out the wire with your fingers. The nice thing about this wire is it comes polished, so you don't need to worry about that. And this is another pair of pliers. This is called a slide plier. It has a this kind of clamp at the end with some notches that I filed into it so that the clamp would grab and wouldn't slip. So now by holding the metal in both ends and slowly pulling out, the metal becomes hardened. And if you ever want to straighten some wire, just do this. Clamp it in both ends, pull it back, and twist it. It doesn't change the diameter. The twisting won't show, but it does become harder, and as you can see, very straight. All right, and you can also see, because as soon as I release it, it wants to spring back, that the metal has become harder. So I'm going to unclamp it and see if it's hard enough. And look how straight that is. Okay, let's see at the tip. Just bend it. Yeah, that's nice and springy. Good. It does bend a little bit, and that's fine. That it will enable us to shape it. All right. So in order to make a pair of ear wires, we're going to start with a very flat end. This is a pair of flush cutting pliers. This side cuts flush, and the other side leaves a little bit of a mark. So I'm going to put it right here, beyond where the plier grip marks are. We'll cut that off. And you can see it cuts almost perfectly flush. We do want it absolutely perpendicular, so just hitting it once or twice with a file will square off the end. And since we want two identical pieces, it's probably a good idea to make them both exactly at the same time. So this is one good end right there, and this is the other. And now we'll use the round pliers to bend both wires exactly the same. These are tapered, so you could bend very small circles or larger circles or anything in between. Grab the wire right at the end and give it a twist as your finger pushes the metal up against the tool. And then you can release it and do it again. Until it meets, and then come back and give it a little twist to straighten it out. Okay, there's one. And do the same thing again. Straighten it out. And this one became a little bit crooked, so I want to line the wire up again. These are little flat nose pliers. And how do they look? Pretty good. Pretty good. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is make a mark on both of them where the bend will be. So they're going to be about this long. This is a permanent marker. Okay, there they go. And the rest of this is done by hand, the rest of the bending. You know, your fingers are really the best tools that exist because you can do a tremendous amount of things with them and they don't leave any marks. So I'm going to remember that's exactly where I'm going to put the other wire, just beyond my nail, just like that. Get it started. Do them in stages. So bend them exactly the same. Compare them. If they're different, and they are, then you can just bend this one a little bit tighter. Bring it in. Okay, the bend is just about at the same point. The correction was made, and now the next step is to complete this one. And I know that the radius was a little larger, so I'm going to make it a little bit larger on this one. And if they're not exactly the same, we can always make them the same. Okay, they're pretty close. One is a little bit longer and a little bit tighter radius. So by bending it right in here, I'll accomplish both things, making it shorter and a larger radius. So I'm just going to stick my finger in there and pull it out just a little bit there. And let's see what that did. Let's compare them and see how they look. Alright, they're about the same length, slightly different shape. So let's correct them by bending one right behind the other. Okay, this one's still a little bit longer, so let's bring it in just a little. And now bend it down to close. Same thing here. Okay, let's check the shapes. They're pretty close. I also noticed that I didn't bend them the same way. This one has the opening out, and this one has the opening in. Now, I didn't plan it that way. I would have preferred to do them the same, but I can correct that easily by grabbing one right at the loop, right exactly there, and very carefully, very slowly, giving it a 180-degree twist. This won't show later. In fact, it'll make this wire just a little bit harder. And you can see that now both of the loops are on the same side. The wires are almost identical. Let's look really closely. They're pretty close. All right. So since they're the same length, I can hold them side by side and clip them both at the same time. Again with the flush cutting pliers. Right about there. And here are the two ear wires. The next thing to do is to bend the end, and for this I'll use the same round nose pliers. Grab it right at the end with the largest size, give it a little twist, and do the same thing with this one. It's really very simple. Just keep in mind that you do the same exact thing to both pieces sequentially. Okay, the last step is to square off the end and then round it so that it's real comfortable going in the ear. You don't want any sharp edges. So by putting the file on and giving it a little bit of a roll, a little flick, without using a lot of force, that will round it completely. Just work your way around. And check it. If you feel any roughness, take it off. Okay, that looks nice and round. All right, and then the second one. Square it off just a little and round it. Now if the ends don't meet exactly, if there's a little bit of a gap, that's okay, because when we put them into the hole, we're going to open that and close that again. All right, well, I guess it's time to do some polishing. You always want to put as high a finish as possible on your jewelry. There are many ways to clean up the little areas where the cuts were made. You can certainly use fine files to get you pretty close, and depending on how accessible the little areas are, you could use abrasive paper, you could wrap it around something. In this case, I'm going to use an abrasive wheel. I keep my burrs and wheels in here. You can see there's a variety of round burrs, different kinds of cutting burrs, different kinds of abrasives, hard abrasives, polishing, soft abrasives, and drill bits over here. They're laid out so that the centers are 20 millimeters apart. That's good enough to get your fingers in there, and also it's enough room to store a large wheel. So for this I'm going to use a little abrasive wheel. They're available in all kinds of shapes, in different grits, and from many different companies. The nice thing about these soft abrasives is that you can carve them to whatever shape you want. But before you do that, and anytime you use a spinning tool, you want to make sure you've got good protection. First of all, you should have goggles that are shatterproof, and also wear a mask so that any little dust particles don't fly into your face. And in order to shape it, just hold it up against a file, the very end of a file, and you can carve it down. You can see the particles coming off of there, and you don't want to breathe them. Make sure to keep the wheel moving, both on the work and up and down the surface of the wheel, because you don't want to gouge the work and you don't want to carve a groove into the wheel either. These wheels are terrific because they are abrasive, but they leave a very high, nearly polished finish on the surface of the metal. You won't be able to get into every little corner until the wheel is smaller. And don't overwork an area, because then you'll have grooves in it. As far as the speed that you use on the handpiece, it really doesn't matter. If you want to go very slowly and be very careful and meticulous, you could do it that way. If you're pretty confident about what you're doing, you can speed it up. And of course, it cuts faster. Okay, that's about all I can do with the wheel this size. In order to get into the smaller areas, we're going to have to carve it down a little smaller. I'm going to put a little bit of a taper onto it so I can get it to really tiny areas. It's a little bit like working with a lathe, and you can see how useful it is. This should get into a lot of the really small, finer areas now. It won't get into the very ends of the corners, but just about everywhere else. Long time ago, an old master said that jewelry making is very simple. There's really only 10 techniques, but there's 10,000 tricks. Keep the wheel moving. The next thing to do is buff the piece. There are two stages to this process. The first is called buffing, and the second is polishing. Buffing is a technique of very gentle abrasion. The best wheel for this job is a hard felt buff. It's mounted on a shaft. There's a screw top so that you can change it. As you can see, we're going to use Tripoli, which is an abrasive compound, for buffing this. Okay, what you want to do is pick up a little bit of the compound with the wheel and very, very lightly buff the surfaces. Keep the wheel moving. Now the alternative is to do this on a polishing lathe, and that'll work just fine, except that this is a very delicate piece, and the polishing lathe is very big, and it's easy to let go of it and have it ruined by the wheels. Very, very light. Tripoli on a wheel like this is very abrasive. It's very aggressive. You really have to be careful to use a light touch, otherwise you're going to round the corners and make the surfaces look irregular. Okay, that's about it. Once again, the speed is really up to you. If you use a slower speed, it'll take a little bit longer. Using a higher speed is a little bit more aggressive. There's a wide variety of wheels and also compounds that you can use. Most suppliers will give you a chart of the products that they offer and tell you what they're best for. That looks good. Let's do the back. Very light touch. I can't stress that enough. When you get started, you tend to overdo it, and you can really ruin a piece quickly. The idea is to keep the corners sharp, and that's why we're using a hard felt wheel. If you used a soft, bushy kind of brush, that tends to round the corners. Alright, that's just about it. The next step is to get the compound off. I'll drop it in the ultrasonic and clean it off completely. Buffing compound and polishing compound are very different. Buffing compound is abrasive. It actually removes metal. while the polishing compound is fine and moves the metal. The polishing compound will become contaminated if there's any buffing compound left. Now the easiest way to remove that is with soapy water, hot soapy water. This is an ultrasonic cleaner. It's designed exactly for this purpose. You can control the temperature of the solution over here, and inside is either a prepared solution from a supplier or something you can mix up yourself. Mild detergent with a drop or two of ammonia works great. And I'm going to put a basket in there, a plastic basket that won't scratch the metal. Put the two pieces in, turn on the ultrasonic waves. Now what's happening is that the hot solution is dissolving the buffing compound, and the ultrasonic waves, or sound waves, vibrates it free. After a couple of minutes, when all the compound is removed, you can rinse off the solution . Or if you have a steamer, like this foot-activated one, you can blow off anything that remains. And now the work is spotless. You can see it puts a real bright, high luster on silver. One of the qualities of silver is that it takes the highest polish of any metal. Keep the wheel moving so that you don't gouge out an area, and you have a nice even polish all over. Okay, now we need to polish the ear wires, and for this I'm going to use a soft felt wheel. Because the shape is so round and delicate, it doesn't need very much. Now you could certainly do this standing up at a polishing lathe, but it's just easier to control by doing it this way. Those polishing lathes are real good for larger pieces that aren't so delicate. As the last step before attaching the ear wires, what I'm going to do is use a vibro engraver and put 925 Alan Revere. 925 stands for sterling silver because sterling silver is 92.5% silver. And now we can attach the ear wires. It's the last step. And this is a good opportunity for me to show you how to open a jump ring. You always open it by twisting it sideways. Slip the piece on. And close it by twisting it sideways. And there we are. Okay, so in this first project, we learned how to lay out a pattern, laminate some metal together with a pattern on top. We learned how to use a center punch, how to drill, pierce, file, form, sand. We learned how to use several different kinds of attachments for the flex shaft, how to buff and polish, bend wire, and how to use liver of sulfur. And As you see here, the design came from this book. Here's the one we did. And you can see that many of these would lend themselves very well to earring designs or pins. There's many resources you can use, and you can also come up with original designs.